American exceptionalism. Some people believe it, some people don't. But what does American exceptionalism mean? The goal of my journey is to get past the buzzword and explore, what does American exceptionalism really mean? I'm Janine Turner. Join me as I speak with scholars and Americans all across the United States about what American exceptionalism means to them, both historically and currently. American exceptionalism, how and why it matters.
Covenant theology, divine providence, natural rights. Both the religious beliefs of our founders and the philosophical Enlightenment combined to create our truly exceptional Declaration of Independence and our United States Constitution. Our founding fathers were the first to put this concept of natural rights, rights that come from our Creator, not a king, in writing, a truly exceptional occurrence. Alexander Hamilton, at the age of 19, wrote in his essay, A Farmer Refuted, quote, "The sacred rights of mankind are not to be rummaged for among old parchments or musty records. They are written as with a sunbeam in the whole volume of human nature by the hand of divinity itself," end quote. These are the foundational influences that created the tenets we hold dear as Americans: freedom, liberty, self-rule. Join me and my special guest, Tony Williams, Senior Fellow at the Bill of Rights Institute, author of 6 books, including Washington and Hamilton, and a Constituting America Fellow, as we discuss the indelible imprint that Protestant beliefs, the brilliance of our founding fathers, and the influence of the philosophers such as the British John Locke and the French Baron de Montesquieu had on American founding principles. Hi, welcome to American Exceptionalism Revealed, How and Why. And our special guest today is Tony Williams. Yay!
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah, it's great to be here in this historic building, the United States Patent Office site. And then this building was the first United States Post Office in Washington, D.C.
Very interesting, right in our nation's capital.
Yeah, it's kind of fun to be here. And it did not burn down in 1812, right, though that was the original building, but that's a completely other story. So we are here to talk about all your numerous fabulous essays for this study, American Exceptionalism Revealed, talking about the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the Federalist Papers, and how they have prevented us from falling into the demise of the rest of history that's scattered around in pieces around us. And that's how we're exceptional, because a lot of times people have that discussion, America's exceptional. No, it's not exceptional. Prove it. And I thought, well, this gives us 90 tools in our toolbox with the 90 essays at constitutingamerica.org to talk about how we are exceptional. And you've written these truly wonderful. Please check out Tony's essays at on American Exceptionalism at constitutingamerica.org. Your essays, well, he's been in all of our studies, right, but we're focusing on American exceptionalism this one. We are going to be talking today about the Mayflower Compact and the Declaration of Independence, what the Federalist Papers thought about the Mayflower Compact, even though they weren't really talking about that at the time, the principles of it, and then what the Constitution, and then hence the Founding Fathers and their principles around the Declaration of Independence. So you have a lot of buzzwords in here. And we throw these words out, but we have a lot of people who watch our show that are youths, rising generations. And I thought, let's break this down. I've been doing this for 13 years, but then before the 13 years, I'm like, who, what, who? We just kind of assume. I'm sort of the middle America person. And I'm always telling people in Washington, D.C., hey, we don't understand all this talk. You got to kind of explain it to us. So let's talk about some of the things in the Mayflower Compact there that you talk about here. Popular sovereignty, representative government, we would think everybody knows that, but limited government, federalism, tricky word, everybody has a different. The anti-federalists said, hey, wait a minute, we're the real federalists, so it would be fun to talk about that. Separation of powers, things of this, and I think there was another one on the next page, Enlightenment to Protestant, we'll get to that in the next one, but let's start with these buzzwords like popular sovereignty.
Right. Well, the American regime, in part what makes it so exceptional is that we are based upon popular sovereignty. And what that simply means is here the people rule. right? And we're a government of laws, not of men, not of dictators, imposing their will on the people. Here the people have power, or they have ultimate authority. In fact, it says so right in the Declaration of Independence, and also in the preamble to the Constitution, says we the people. Mm-hmm. And so the people rule, and they give representatives the ability to represent them in the government.
And that's also in the United States Constitution in the Declaration of Independence, when I'm teaching the students, I talk about, we all know this line. We're given by our Creator these unalienable rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. But that second line, that we are going to create a government, and that the government is going to have to be accountable to us and to the consent of the people. Let's talk about that a little bit, because that fits into popular sovereignty. Now we know that means it's, instead of a king is sovereign, we are sovereign. But we have to be active, we have to be involved. But that's what all these documents give us, which leads to American exceptionalism. But the consent of the governed, really, it's not we the government, which a lot of people think these days. It's still we the people. But if we don't know what they're doing, if we don't know what the rules are in the Constitution, we can't keep track. Really, the consent of the governed is very important to follow through.
Yeah, that's a great line in the Declaration, right? To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And of course, we have a constitutional order. The government's empowered to do certain things, but it's limited to those powers. It's a system based upon popular self-rule, right? That we are the government, and we have representatives too, and that we're supposed to deliberate, and we're supposed to debate and discuss and compromise, and that our representatives are supposed to, as Madison put it in the Federalist Papers, refine and enlarge our views, right? And really engage in their own deliberation and discussion, right? That's what self-government's all about, our active participation, and not just in voting either, right? But on a daily basis in the public square and in civil society.
We've talked about that a lot on this show, the importance of deliberation and debate, and that minority and majority voices must be heard. And that's why we can accept when things don't go our way, because we still have a voice and we still have hope. So being an active citizen is voting, but it's also being open to a civic conversation.
Right. We unfortunately are losing that art, right? But for a very long time, we know that we all have certain principles, but we may differ over policies. And so that's part of a healthy democracy, right? It's supposed to be a little bit messy in the public square. Politics is a little bit messy in the halls of Congress. There's a lot of debates, a lot of discussions. But in the end, it's to get to a just policy for the common good. And you might not get everything you want, but that's okay, because we're a system based upon majority rule and the protection of minority rights.
I like that. Majority rule, but protection of minority rights. That's really good. And the more we sort of shut down speech, the more we become a monolithic, that leads to dictatorship.
It's very troubling, right? Shutting down free speech, shutting down that deliberation, but also just not listening to the other guy. We have to start listening a little bit more and stop talking so much, stop demonizing the other side, and just know that we're in a common venture as Americans to make this republic work.
And we come from I talk with the students about this a lot, we come from all over the world to make this country. So and everybody brings their own culture, their own ideas. It's, I believe, a detriment to the country if we think everyone has to think the same. It is that uniqueness of thought from various people and the ability to have that deliberation and debate and be willing to listen that has made us truly exceptional. Okay, let's move on to another, representative government.
Right.
We are a republic. So many people think we are a democracy.
We're not a direct democracy. People do use the word democratic or democracy, and Lincoln employed that language. I don't think it's wrong sort of informally, but we are officially a constitutional republic.
The government.
Yes, and so that implies self-rule and popular sovereignty, representation. It also implies that we have a written constitution and we follow the rule of law in this country. But ultimately, it's where the people rule and where the people govern themselves through their representatives. And that makes Congress and our state legislatures, our local governments, very important branches and levels of government.
Which is why it's so important to realize if we were a democracy, we would all have to stop. Whoops,
Right.
got to go vote. And then we might not even know what the issues are. And we're such a big country now. A pure democracy really would never work. Right. We sort of hire people with our vote to go represent us and listen to us, and then go do the work for us because we have our own lives to do. And I think that's why a representative government is really. Also, they can cool down the passions, and we won't become a word we were talking about yesterday, mobocracy. But we're kind of stepping into federalism. Limited government. Let's talk about limited government because that's how you have it listed in his wonderful essay. Limited government.
Yes. So limited government means that the government is bound by the constitutional rule of law. I think we do need to recognize that Madison and the other framers did empower the government, right? It did make it stronger than under the Articles of Confederation. However, it's still limited. It still has certain powers, certain enumerated powers, and some implied powers related to those enumerated powers. And enumerated powers are the listed powers. Implied powers are reasonable powers related to those listed powers. But even so, the government cannot and should not go beyond those boundaries. Now, sometimes the boundaries are a little
necessary and proper clauses caused a lot of issues.
Right. So there are some vague clauses in there that has allowed government at times to solve problems, but at other times to overstep its boundaries.
Exactly. So limited government is important. That's why the checks and balances. I think that the checks and balances, we focus on our rights so much, but the checks and balances really keep the any sort of anarchy or monarchy, dictatorship from rearing its ugly head. That really have everybody. The checks. A lot of times we don't have time to go through all the checks, but the checks are pretty cool. We should do a whole segment just on the checks. Federalism. All right. We have the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Of course, the Federalists were John J. Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, under the code name Publius, wrote 85 opinion editorials published in the newspapers all across the states, so people would understand what the Constitution was about. Wonderful, too, that the people were so involved and that they made it rather specific for them. I think that's important. And then the Anti-Federalist, to debate the Federalist, stepped forward, Brutus, which we think maybe was Robert Yates. Yates was one of them, right? They came forward and said, wait. They debated the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. So then there was this word federalism, and I hear it used even today in all kinds of different ways. Federal government means the national government, and yet the national government includes federalism because federalism means the states, and that local government is incredibly important. So, and then people say, no, we're a federal government. No, we're not a federal government. Oh, the government in Washington is a federal government. No, it's a national government. So why don't we go ahead and take the time with an expert like you and talk about what federalism really means and how that fits into our government?
Right. Well, the principle of federalism is understanding the proper relationship between the different levels of government. That there are certain powers the national government has, but also powers that the states have and the local governments. And, I think we need to respect that more because local governments are really good at solving local problems. And that's really the first place we should look. We typically look to not only the national government, but the presidents to solve all of our problems. And I think we should start with our local communities. And then we should also go to the states. The states have a large impact over our daily lives and are closer to the people, right? The state and local governments closer to the people can solve problems easier. The national government, I think, has certain powers and certain boundaries of authority that we should look to for national defense or treaties or larger policies that affect all of us. But increasingly, we've deferred a lot to the national government and given it more and more authority, and it's taken more and more authority over the course of the 20th century, and particularly the executive branch of government.
So federalism, though, how do you define federalism?
Federalism is each level of government has its respective powers, right? And sometimes it creates tensions because they have concurrent or shared powers at the same time. And so federalism is simply the relationship between the different levels of government.
So in other words, it's not one government out of DC for everybody. We have state constitutions, then we have local governments, districts, things of that nature. So federalism then, if I'm understanding correctly, is the fact that it's not just one big government, one size fits all. It's the inclusion of the states. Right?
And the
so would you call DC the federal government? Or what government?
I never do.
Yeah, some people do. So, but that would be incorrect then to say that DC is the federal government. What would you call DC?
It's in our popular parlance, but I always call it the national government, just to clarify, because I'm a guy who really cares about the principle of federalism. So I always call it the national.
So federalism is more geared toward the states. Inclusion of the states in the process.
Right. It's understanding that relationship.
So if you really understand federalism, you would know that when you say federalism, it includes the national government, it also includes the states.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
So federalism can work as well, including DC, but it's not to the exclusion of DC.
Right, and that's a really important point, right, for self-government. We want to govern ourselves with other members of our communities, with people who are closer to us in our states, right? Again, the national government has certain very important powers to exercise, but it should be limited, right? And as I said, we really should look to our local governments to engage in local self-governance with each other.
I talk about that with the students quite often. I say, okay, when you start voting, how often will you be voting? They're like, every 4 years. I'm like, for whom will you be voting? The president. I'm like, oh, interesting. So we walk through a petition and something they want to change in their neighborhoods, which has been everything from save the platypuses, to being able to dig a well in my backyard. It's fascinating to hear what the kids have to say. Too many drugs in my area, too much trash, and we need more lights, more speed bumps, whatever they might have save the park. And then we write a petition and we talk about the fact that, well, you would take it. We try to keep it on the Constitution, which is more, but you could take it to your local government, your state government. You could also take it to your representative for the House of Representatives in D.C. And they and you have to vote for them, by the way, every 2 years. And so it's a lesson that people aren't learning. I think when students are taught this in schools, it's here's your worksheet, this is what they do. Instead of this is what you do. This is how you come forward. Bills aren't something that they're making up. Bills are what you want. And so it's empowering the students to really understand that. Okay, so local governments, I remember on Northern Exposure, we would have all these rowdy, Alaskan scenes. We
I remember.
Our like puffy coats and our snow boots, and we'd be talking about we want that stop sign.
Right.
And that's what I think with television, probably, and now it's made us sort of this national mindset, and yet when it gets down to it, we may not want our Slurpees limited to a certain size in Texas that's happening in New York City. And that's really important. That's where federalism fits in. What we want in Euless, Texas may be very different than what they want in Maine or Seattle.
Bingo. I mean, that's why the founders put it in there, because they knew the national government had certain powers to exercise, but most self-governance would occur on the local level. And it was okay for someone in San Francisco to approach things a little differently than someone in Kansas, for example.
Yeah. That's a key word. It's okay.
Right.
It's okay if they think differently in San Francisco than Kansas. Sure. We need to accept that. Right. But television makes us feel like we all need to think the same.
Right. It's a very national perspective.
Yeah. National perspective. Someone had said that the local news is no longer where people don't really tune into the local news. It's now national news, so people are losing sight of that. Okay, so federal government is okay as long as we're acknowledging it doesn't just mean D.C., it means state and local government. Right. Or we could say this is the federalist aspect, and it's the national government. Okay. Yeah, good. We were breaking it down. Separation of powers, briefly, that seems so obvious, but it's really, I think, one of the things that makes America exceptional is this great compromise. It was the Connecticut Compromise, right? It was New Jersey. It was there were two others before.
New Jersey and Virginia Plan.
Right. The New Jersey, the Virginia Plan ended up with the Connecticut Compromise, and they also call it the Great Compromise. But the way the House and the Senate is set up, and the checks and balances between the executive branch and the judicial branch, even we're seeing that as well. Fascinating. Let's talk about separate. That's really what keeps our freedoms.
Yes, because I mean, all of these constitutional principles go to a certain understanding of human nature, right? That we're flawed, but we're capable of virtue. We're capable of self-governance, but we're also prone to mobocracy, as you said, to our passions. So there are all these devices that limit power, right? And limit not only the power of the government, but also of the governed, as Madison says in Federalist 51. And so to control that power, to control human nature, all these devices, constitutional devices, were instituted. And separation of powers, meaning that this is a very powerful central government. So what do? You divide that power up between the executive branch, the president, the legislative branch, the Congress, and the court system, the federal courts, Supreme Court. And each one has its sphere of power, right, that it exercises. But as you say, it also has some power over the other to check that power in checks and balances.
The House checks the Senate with the bills, and the Senate checks the House, and then once they agree on a bill, it goes to the president, and he can veto it or sign it, veto it, goes back, and then the Supreme Court can look at it if they're asked to do so. It's really, and I even love the checks that a treaty has, when the president, one man, can't go abroad, make a treaty, come back, it has to be ratified, approved by the Senate. Right. And they get around that now with things like, executive agreements. Oh, it's not really a treaty, which is what I say, we got to be careful.
Well,
okay.
You point to a good point, though, real quick, that the separation of powers also applies in that bicameral principle, right? In that two-house legislature, right? They're separating them, but they also have checks on each other. Federalism itself is sort of a form of separation of powers, right? And so that separation of powers principle even goes farther than what we normally think.
It really does. In the House of Representatives in D.C., they're looking after the people of the state, and then the Senate is really supposed to be sort of looking out of the state. The senators looking after the states as a whole. Right. So that's another sort of check. It was originally supposed to be the state legislatures, but that changed. But they're still probably, I'm looking after the state.
Right. As opposed to my district and the people in my district.
I just think it's really fascinating. Right. I think this is exceptional and fun. Let's talk about some other keywords: Enlightenment and Protestantism, and how that played a big factor, which goes into your next essay about actually the Declaration of Independence. And it also feeds into sort of the whole Communist Manifesto, which is next. But that we, because of our inherent faith, we realize that we're not angels, as opposed to thinking, oh, we are angels. It's a big difference, because we are not, and that leads to terrible things, which is more like the Communist Manifesto. But that's later. But I think it's interesting to talk about what's this word? Our Mayflower, when they came, they weren't really under the Enlightenment yet. So that was the faith. Let's talk about that first.
Right. So I think there are four major strains of thought shaping the American Revolution. One of them, which is often ignored, as you just asked about, is Protestantism. Almost everyone in the American colonies was of a Protestant denomination, of a Protestant 98%?
Faith.
98%?
Is that a fun fact, or is that
98.4%, as
really?
I think some historians
that's
have
pretty
estimated.
amazing. I don't think people really realize that.
A smattering of Catholics and Jews, but primarily Protestants. And it shaped their way of thinking about the world, right, in two major ways. One is this resistance theology that, Protestants demanding civil and religious liberty, but also that very strong streak of individualism and congregationalism that was present in Protestantism.
What do you mean by congregationalism?
That there's not much hierarchy, that each church kind of establishes its own local community and elects its own pastors and so forth. So it's highly individualistic in that way, and very community-based, as opposed to a hierarchical Catholic Church, for example.
But they were accountable to their principles and their values and their rules from God.
And to God. Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, for sure.
That was first and foremost.
Right. But, and they were a people of the book, right? So people of the Bible, and very high literacy rates. And, they had a very biblically based theology.
Right. Okay. And then, so when they were here, Were they studying Locke yet, or that came with the Enlightenment? It was a little bit later.
Yeah, a little bit later. We have this Enlightenment coming out of the scientific revolution. Enlightenment meaning, to bring forth light, to bring forth the reason into the world. Of course, that's kind of a loaded term, right? Because in this age of reason, you're sort of implying that what came before wasn't very reasonable because it was a little bit more rooted in the faith.
What does Enlightenment mean? Because we have our Protestantism,
right,
and the Quakers and the Puritans that came here.
Right.
But when we get to Enlightenment, what was the branch off?
Yes, it's an age of science, an age of sort of materialism, of looking at the universe in a certain way, sort of a more secular way, but an age also of great learning and science discovery, and very cosmopolitanism in the way that they approached learning.
What do you mean by cosmopolitan?
Yeah, that there was this international conversation among intellectuals and through scientific
There's a lot
journals.
of philosophy.
There was a lot of philosophy traveling, across, especially the Western world in Europe.
I think,
and
therefore,
America.
I am.
Exactly.
He was early. He was earlier, wasn't he?
Yeah, it was a little earlier. But yeah, then you start to get into a lot of these thinkers like Locke and Rousseau and Montesquieu and so forth. Yeah, and so you have this great expansion of learning and great examination of human nature and best forms of government and political philosophy in these thinkers as well.
So I'm a Christian, but I happen to love philosophy.
Right.
Love philosophy. I love to think. I love Plato's forms, that whatever's happening up there is happening here. And I'm like, oh, it's this parallel string theory. You know what I mean? It's metaphysics, quantum physics. They divide the cell and they do the same thing. Atom. I think it's a better word. But let's talk about, so now they were Mayflowers, Puritans, Quakers, and now Enlightenment is happening. So we hear these words a lot. Locke, John Locke. We hear Montesquieu. We hear Rousseau. Rousseau's the French Revolution. We'll talk about later. Really went the Rousseau route. But we were really intrigued. Would you say talk to us about John Locke, who he was, what he believed, and Montesquieu.
Right. So John Locke is an British thinker, and he is writing during the time of some tumultuous events in Great Britain associated with the Glorious Revolution, which was the final way to solve this decades-long feud between the monarchy and Parliament.
Is that the 1600s?
Yeah, so 1688 is when the Glorious Revolution takes place. And Locke is one of the authors of the English Bill of Rights, which limits the power of the monarchy and preserves more power in Parliament. And so this profoundly shapes the American colonies even early on during the time, but then especially the American revolutionaries and founders later.
And he said life, liberty, property.
Yes.
Didn't he?
Yeah,
or is it property exactly? Or life, liberty, property?
Yeah. So he talked about a state of nature and how would humans act in a state of nature. They have natural rights, right?
But did he say they come from God?
Yes.
He did.
Yeah,
okay.
From nature and nature's God, as Jefferson points out in, it's a very natural law conception of both reason and revelation. Mm-hmm. And so, and the revolutionaries look to him as he has these ideas about human nature and natural rights, and the basic purpose of government is to protect those rights. And if any government becomes destructive of those ends, he talked about the right of the people, after a long train of abuses, to overthrow that government and institute new government.
Very much like the Declaration.
That sounds familiar, right?
Yeah.
Very much shaped the Declaration, but also shaped just the American revolutionaries thinking about revolution and the purpose of government and so forth, about self-government, about building a republic. And Americans read about these principles and heard about them, not only in the Declaration, but in the pamphlets of the time, in newspapers. They heard it, in public debates. But interestingly enough, they also heard these ideas from Locke from the pulpit, because a lot of the ministers were saying that the same kind of ideas in what was called covenant theology, that your natural rights are from God, and you had a responsibility to preserve them and protect them, and to be a virtuous citizen, a virtuous human being. And if you didn't, God would punish you, but if you abided by those virtues, then you would be blessed. And
so
that's
covenant theology is really interesting.
Yeah.
So God's given us this covenant, he's given us these gifts, and we have to, honor them.
Right, and it's basically the entire idea of American exceptionalism, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the two tied together very nicely. This theological view, but then also this, sort of secular Republican view as well.
Enlightenment as well.
Yeah. Yep.
Right. And then talk about Montesquieu.
Yeah.
He's French.
He's a French Enlightenment thinker, right? Sort of a small R Republican who supports Republican forms of government. And while he generally thought that a smaller republic was more possible than our large republic, our Madisonian republic, that he was really strong on talking about separation of powers, checks and balances, that he had maybe a more realistic view of human nature and understood that power needed to be divided because, under the absolute divine right monarchies of Europe in the 1600s, 1700s, a lot of that power had been abused. And so as he has these Republican writings, he's urging separation of power, checks and balances, these principles to control the government.
So there we get our checks and balances from Montesquieu.
Very important influence.
We get life, liberty, property, from Locke.
Right.
And then we get a balance of powers from Montesquieu. Important to read. You don't get this from a soundbite, or from a clickbait on Twitter.
Right, we have to turn off our phones and
read
some Montesquieu.
Need to actually read. Okay, so Montesquieu, very interesting. And interesting you say small R Republican.
Yeah.
There was a thought that a large republic couldn't work. And one of the reasons it's exceptional with our founding fathers, I think the way they got around that was to have the federalism that, yes, it's a large republic, but we have these republics within the states. And then you divide it down into districts and localities and mayors and things of that nature. So that's how they thought it could work.
Right, and that was a great anti-federalist fear, right, of Brutus and the other writers, that they fear this consolidation of power, this national consolidation. Unfortunately, a lot of that's come true. But they fear that. They fear that centralization of power, that it would spawn despotism, that it would spawn sort of dictatorship. And so, they were very... They were urging the Federalists to adopt a more local state perspective. Mm-hmm. But I think it's very important to note that in this whole Federalist, anti-Federalist debate, they all support the principle of federalism. It's just, the Federalists are a little bit more willing to grant a little bit more national powers to the central government, the anti-Federalists less. But there was largely a consensus that you didn't want to give all the power to the national government and that you needed a federal system in a large republic.
Hence federalism.
Hence federalism.
Okay, so let's see. Let's talk about what Jefferson said, that the Declaration of Independence, I think we've already talked about this really, but they really weren't new ideas. It was a part of the, how do you put it? It was an expression of the American mind, that Americans were already thinking this. And they just he just put it to paper. And I feel so sorry for John Adams, who doesn't have a statue in this city, because they wanted John Adams to write it, and
right.
He could have written it. They
right.
asked him to write it,
right.
But he said, "No, if I write it, I'm from Massachusetts. It's got to be someone from Virginia," and he had Jefferson write it. So Jefferson gets all the credit, and of course he is wonderful. But they argued over word after word of it forever in the Congress. So I'm not demoting Jefferson, but
right.
So many had a part of it,
yeah.
And so many of our founding fathers, and John Adams was one of them. But the harmonizing sentiments of the day, Jefferson said, common sense. I think that Thomas Paine really wasn't he the one that was just really anti-king?
Right. In the pamphlet comments.
Yeah,
right.
The divine rights. We get our rights not from a king, but from He said it in a common way.
Right.
That people could understand.
The common sense, or the plain sense of the matter, right? Something people could readily understand at the time. It was the Harry Potter of its day, this pamphlet. I mean, it sold hundreds of thousands of copies in a country with a population of a little over 2 million. I mean, it was a bestseller.
Uh-huh. Common sense, because he said it in a common way. There's something to be said for that.
Right.
Let's talk about James Otis, who talked about natural law at great length, or much earlier in 1764.
Right. So Otis is a Boston lawyer who, in some famous cases and pamphlets, talks about natural law and natural rights in 1761, 1764. I mean, this is before the Stamp Act and all the taxes and the Tea Party and all of that. So this is very early, even really before the American Revolution. And he's talking about the natural rights of the people. Interestingly enough, he also says they apply to both black and white. He saw this as a universal principle for all people.
Yeah, most of our founding fathers really did think that. They gave us the foundation to then go have the amendment process, which I think is pivotal. They gave us the foundation. Okay, this is the best we can do now. Now you go, American people. So with the amendment process, I think that's kept the Constitution valid and given us the opportunity to let it change the times. And of course, we did that with after the Civil War.
Supports popular sovereignty, right?
Yeah.
And self-rule, right? That as as the years progress, the people and the representatives can have a say in shaping new amendments to the Constitution.
People forget about amendments. They think they just want a law changed or acts, but they can be reversed. An amendment really sticks. It takes some time, but you have to get everybody. And what so few people know, and I think this is American exceptionalism right here. The amendment process, one way it can happen is through Congress.
Right.
The people start it with petitioning and say, we want this, let's say a balanced budget amendment, and it goes to the Congress, and the Congress can say yes or no. And then if the Congress says yes for all the other amendments that we do have, it has to be ratified then by the states.
Right.
So every state has to be included in a federalist way.
There you go.
The states you just can't do this to us. But what our founding fathers also put in the Constitution is, wait a minute, if Congress won't listen to the people, the National Congress, if they won't limit their budget or limit their terms, we can do it through. Our founders said you could do it through. You can call your own convention. The states can call a convention to pass an amendment, and then it has to be ratified by the states. Very much the way they changed the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution. But we can call a convention of the states. I don't think anybody knows about that.
Right.
That's another way to get around the power of. They didn't just worry about a dictator from a king. They worried about tyranny from a Congress.
Right, and as you said, this supports self-rule. This supports the principle of federalism. And the other thing to note is that there's a very high standard for this. Right, it's usually a 2/3 vote, 3/4 ratification by the states. There's a very high standard because we are altering fundamental law. Right, of the written Constitution, and so that's properly held to a very high standard. It's not easy to do.
Yes, but we shouldn't forget to do it.
Well,
and we're so
true.
close to calling our first convention of states,
Right.
are we not? We're
Yes.
like one vote away in 20-something or another.
Right. There's a movement to do so.
We're very close. People are scared of the convention of states because they think it's going to start off. They'll wipe out the Constitution, but I don't fear it. Do you fear it?
I think if it's for a specific issue, that's fine. I think if people are going to start trying to rewrite the Constitution or start over again and get it right this time, I think that's a little more troubling.
Yeah. Well, I think this time, when they wrote the Constitution last time, they closed all the windows. They didn't let anybody in for 3 months. It was very secret. It couldn't be secret today. I think we would know if they were in there trying to do something radical. It would be tweeted out or social media all over the place. So I agree with you. If they let it be one subject, and then you elect from the state legislatures someone to go represent the state, because the states would then call the convention. That's the epitome of federalism.
Right.
It's taking it away from the national government. If you won't pass this in the national way, we will do it through the states, which inherently means the people.
Exactly right.
Isn't it exceptional?
It's wonderful.
Alexander Hamilton, one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, but this is in The Farmer Refuted.
Right.
He wrote this beautiful, you have it in your essay. But
By the way, he's about 19 when he writes.
No!
I mean, it's incredible.
You're kidding. He was 19.
It's important to
And
note,
what was
right?
The Farmer Refuted? Because we've heard.
Right, so he's writing an essay about American ideals, American principles. This is in 1775. This is a year before the Declaration, and he has this wonderful articulation of these Lockean principles of natural rights and the purpose of government to protect those rights. He has that wonderful quote. He says, "The sacred rights of mankind are not to be rummaged for among old and musty parchments, but are instead written by the hand of divinity upon the entire volume of human nature itself, and cannot be obscured or erased by any mortal power." I mean,
you left out the sunbeam part, though. There's a sunbeam. As a writer, he says, they are written as with a sunbeam.
That's right, by the hand of divinity. I mean, it's really great because it's expressing the same principles of the Declaration of Independence in a really beautiful and articulate way, especially for a 19-year-old. That really captures the importance of natural rights in what the revolutionaries were doing.
He truly was an exceptional writer.
Oh, it was.
I mean, rummaging through natural rights as sacred of mankind. You can't rummage it through old parchments or musty records because it's innate.
Right.
Saying it's innate. God gives it to us. Yes. You're not going to find it in old parchment.
Right. And he's saying it's not found in Magna Carta only. It's not found in the English Bill of Rights. It's not found in these older documents, which are important, but Hamilton, later on the Declaration, is going to create a regime that is based upon an understanding of our rights from God, not from government, and not from just some older documents.
Which, well, actually, it did differ from the Magna Carta a little bit, right? The Magna Carta was the king still has the rights.
Right.
The rights are still coming from the king.
Right.
It was sort of for the aristocracy.
Yeah, there's a few limits in there, but
so we were sort of the first to come out and put on paper.
This idea of natural rights is a very exceptional American idea.
Yeah. There you go. Okay, so maybe we should. In one last thing, do you want to talk about the Supreme Judge of the world, or the Creator in the Constitution?
Sure.
Do you feel?
Sure.
I mean, in the Declaration.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I mean, in the Declaration of Independence, influenced in part by this Protestant theology and this Lockean understanding of the Enlightenment and natural rights, has four mentions of God. Right, and those four mentions include one, nature, and nature's God is sort of the God, the author of natural law, of natural rights. The second one is, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They're endowed by their creator. So a creator God, sort of almost a legislative branch, giving these laws, giving these rights. The third mention of God in the Declaration is the supreme judge of the world, that the revolutionaries were going to submit the rectitude of their actions and intentions, as they said, to the supreme judge of the world, meaning that, they were willing to submit what they were doing to a higher authority, that they felt that what they were doing was just and right. And finally, they were going to be guided, as they said, by the hand of divine providence, that God was going to intervene in their affairs if they upheld the ideals and principles and virtues that they believed God intended for them. So very much sort of a product of that covenant theology we talked about with the Puritans. So the divine providence, more of an executive branch, supreme judge of the world, obviously more of a judicial understanding of God. So it's very interesting how that separation of powers can even sort of influence how they understand God in the Declaration.
Yeah, you broke it down to the Is this where you broke it down, the legislative and the Supreme Court? Is this kind of what it was? That
right.
Each branch had its own.
So we have the creator as the legislator. We have the supreme judge of the world as sort of the judge, the supreme judge of the world, the judicial branch. And then finally, we have the divine providence as sort of an executive, as guiding our hand.
Love that. And that makes us exceptional.
That was a big part of it.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful discussion. I appreciate you.
It was a lot of fun. Thank you very much.
You're awesome. Thank you so much. Tony Williams, everybody. Go read all of his wonderful essays. And then he's also a senior fellow at the Bill of Rights Institute, a fellow at Constituting America, and has written many books, 6 books.
6 books.
One is Washington and Hamilton. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Janine.